Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Reset Now podcast. I'll be your host today, Akhila, and today we're joined by Professor Samarajiva to help us better understand the quagmire that is the electricity problem in Sri Lanka. Professor Samarajiva is a founding chair of Learn Asia, an ICT policy and regulation think tank active across emerging Asia and the Pacific. He was Director General of Telecommunications in Sri Lanka, a founding director of the ICT Agency of Sri Lanka, an honorary professor at the University of Muratua, visiting professor of economics and infrastructures at the University of Delft of Technology in Netherlands, and associate professor of communications and public policy at the Ohio State University in the United States. So, Professor, we're glad to have you here. So, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this problem. On the 15th of February, the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka approved a new tariff structure, which averages at about 66% increase across the board. Is this a long-term solution for the problem that we have right now, or is this merely a band-aid?
Well, we had highly distorted tariffs in Sri Lanka, and since about 90% of the costs for producing electricity, to many people's surprise, are completely out of our control. It's the cost of fuel and coal, right? So you have to have some mechanism where the price is reflective of the ups and downs of the of petroleum product or fossil fuels, you would say, right? So we didn't have that. So when you don't have that, it then has enormous bad effects on the economy, right? You have you could even have your banking system affected, because these are very large losses that we are incurring if we are buying high in dollars and pricing low in rupees, right?
Right.
So some adjustment had to be done. But the problem is that we don't have a good way of regulating these prices. So that means in the long term, this kind of sort of arbitrary tariff increases,
Right.
I use that term pointedly, cannot go on. So you need to have a better way of setting these tariffs. So short term, some adjustment was necessary.
Yes.
Was it this particular adjustment? Was it 66%? Not 56? Not. I'm not making a comment on that.
Right.
The particular band structure, where tariffs for this sector, this and the tariffs for religious establishments are that. I'm also not making a comment on that. But I'm saying in the short term, there was a need to prevent the electricity board from sort of taking down the rest of the system.
Right.
And then in the long term, we need to find a solution, sort of a fair, transparent, rational tariff setting scheme.
Right, Professor. So you did speak about our cost-reflective pricing, right? And the Energy Minister recently, in a statement, stated that the revenue from this cost-effective pricing of the increased tariffs will not be used to pay off CEB debt, but will be rather used to maintain continuous supply to the grid. How sustainable do you think a decision like this is when you take into consideration that there's a lot of circular debt that goes on with the CEB, CPC, and the Treasury?
Well, you're asking, I think there's some political considerations here, which is if for example, just take that simple statement, which is we are raising tariffs so that we can pay off debt incurred in the past. So people will say, what? How could that be? So obviously then it's not cost reflective.
Yes.
Cost reflective is cost reflective at this moment, right? For various sins and omissions of the past, you're going to charge more than cost at this point,
right,
to settle the problems from the past. So politically, it's sort of, politically, everything is unacceptable. It's sort of more unacceptable and more unpalatable to say that. Now, in the big picture, will some of the money go to settling debts? I think it will.
Right.
But, these kinds of opaque statements are part of the mess that we are dealing with.
Right. So, speaking of the tariff bandwidths that you spoke of earlier, subsidies were a large part of the issue that led to CEB being in debt. While it was necessary to increase tariffs to reflect increases in fuel expenditure, coal expenditure, how can we assure that access to electricity is still assured? Because if we do keep, because in the lowest band from 0 to 9 units, I think there was a 265% increase. And perhaps such a large increase in such a short period of time might be unpalatable to those individuals. So, how do we make sure that we still have access to those individuals?
Well, the first thing to remember is that you see, electricity is almost it's the connections have been given to 99.3 or 5 or something. Like almost all the households in this country are connected to the grid, right? So if you look at that, then it's a highly unequal society.
Yes.
And we have a very large number of people in marketing terms, socioeconomic classification E. That would be the lower part of the income distribution. And they would have been, their ranks would have swelled because of the crisis. So the question is, but the question also, so I'm saying there's a legitimate concern there, right? But I'm also saying that a large number of them were paying less than 300 rupees, right? Now, if you really just take that single number and have the fact that the Sri Lanka Electricity Board, Ceylon Electricity Board, actually sends a human being to around 5 million households, because I said all the households are customers. And in some cases, there's a human being going there, or in majority of the cases, a human being going there to collect 300 rupees, right? Now, if you really look at the question, I think any private sector person or anybody who sort of got any sort of sense of costs and so on would say that taking a human being from an office and walking them into somebody's house, spend a few minutes there and walk them back. And then on top of that, to generate a bill, an actual bill using computer capacity, paper, ink, and so on, that would take more than 300 rupees.
Yes, sure.
Right? So it's sort of completely illogical, the whole business of actually providing monthly bills and sending meter readers out and giving them additional incentive payments for reading the meter, and then another incentive payment for reading the meter accurately.
Yes.
The whole thing is illogical.
Right.
I mean, from beginning to end, the thing is illogical. Because if it was a sort of a cost-conscious organization, a private company, they would say, well, this doesn't make any sense, right? So we need to either give you prepaid, where you go to some place, some bank, some supermarket or something, and you put some money into this account, which people do for all kinds of other things, like for their mobile phones, right? Those same households have a mobile phone also.
Yep.
And the phone company doesn't send somebody to their home to read a meter, right? We are not going to do this meter reading business. We are not going to generate bills for you. Or we are going to do it once in 3 months. Or, you do something like that, something rational like that. Now, of course, we are not in the rational world when we are talking about a state-owned enterprise. It's a different world, something else. So something has to be done here. Now, so definitely, because you see, the government says, they have a national energy policy and strategies that was approved by Cabinet in August of 2019. It says lifeline electricity tariff will be limited only to low user household customers using less than 30 kilowatt hours per month, 30 units per month. A study will be conducted by the ministry in 2020 to decide other target groups, things of that nature. I mean, these are all things that they have looked at. So lifeline tariffs is nothing, there's nothing wrong with them.
Okay.
It's good to have them, but then you can't have lifeline tariffs that are completely unreflective of the costs of providing.
Okay.
You have to actually take some measures to get those costs down.
Mhm.
Things were so irrational that, and the other point that a lot of people make is, why are you increasing those amounts? The issue is that if you don't increase those amounts, there are so few people in the above 60 category,
Yes.
right? That's definitely less than 50% are above the above 60 units category, that you really won't get a yield. The revenue increase that you want cannot be achieved by simply piling it all on the high income users.
Okay. Right. So that brings me to my next question, Professor. What are the other ways that we can look at into reducing the inefficiencies within CEP?
Well, that's where I said the whole tariff setting mechanism is I would say broken, or it never worked from the start.
Right.
So, in the basic way you think about tariffs of monopoly suppliers of water, of electricity, anything, right, is that you try to get a sense of what the proper costs are. Then, and you make sure that people don't stuff unnecessary costs in, right? So that's the lowest possible cost structure. Then you recognize, I'm giving the sort of the theoretical model, you recognize that money has a cost. That is, money is not free.
Yes.
So, through bonds or something else, or otherwise, when you take any pile of money that is invested in any business, it has to be more than what one would get from putting it in a fixed deposit.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's risk involved here, no risk involved there. So it has to be above. That's common sense.
Yes, definitely.
So in that world, you have to have a return on the capital that has been invested in the electricity company. So we call this, I used to teach this stuff, we call this rate of return regulation.
Okay.
Very ugly sounding thing. But what it means that first we have a rate base, that is the accepted costs.
Okay.
Then that is X. Then we have another component which says some percentage of X, which is the allowed rate of return. Then you have the total revenue that is allowed.
Right.
Once you have the total revenue, then you break it down into the very different tariff structures for industry, for people who get the electricity at higher levels of voltage, who want more guarantees of regular supply, and so on and so forth. That's how you do conventional tariff regulation.
Okay.
Now, because this is a monopoly, not only here, but even in the United States, it's a monopoly in most cases. So anytime there's a monopoly, there's an incentive for the company to pad the costs. Because remember, if you go with the equation, if you can somehow get the cost, sneak something into the cost, make it higher, then the percentage rate of return on the higher number will be higher than with reasonable costs, right?
Yeah.
So in order to prevent that, the real battle in utility regulation, tariff regulation, is trying to figure out what the reasonable costs are. So the company say that's a reasonable cost. Somebody else said, no, that's not reasonable. Take it out. So now I can remember there was a court case in the US where AT&T, nobody remembers. Oh, AT&T I think is still there. the old telephone monopoly back in the 60s, 70s, and so on, they had put a hunting lodge in.
Right.
A hunting lodge to which they took various guests to entertain them. So one of the decisions was, that's not an allowed cost. That's not a reasonable cost of providing telephone service. That you have fireplaces and all kinds of luxuries and guns and so on and so forth, and people working there to essentially pander to legislators and regulators and so on. That's not an acceptable cost. So you take it out. So, because if you kept it in, there would be a percentage of that you would get as a profit too.
Yeah.
Now, what we have is an inability of the regulator to actually examine the reasonableness of the costs, even though they are mandated to do that in the law. They don't have the time, they don't have the expertise. And then how to judge whether that is reasonable or not. Even if you do that, right? Now I'll come back to the solution to that we have found. Even if you do that, what you can do is to disallow certain costs. So if you just take an arbitrary number, the costs are, let's say 1,000 billion rupees. Now, after all this song and dance, hiring consultants, poking at the numbers, you say, 100 billion of that, at least 10% of that, is unreasonable. We won't allow that. Now, if it was a private company, what would happen is that if they want to continue to do that, which they did in the past and then they want to do in the future, they'll have to, it won't be covered by the tariff.
Okay.
It's outside the tariff. And they'll have to eat it. They'll have to take it out of their profits.
Yes.
So I'm going to keep my hunting lodge because it still is profitable, useful to me, but it's not part of the rate base. Right? I mean, I'm not prohibited from having a hunting lodge, but it's not part of the rate base. It has to come out of my profits. So now you have incentives for the private investor to include only reasonable costs in the rate base. If it's a government organization, now what happens? That really hits the guy's bottom line, right? If it's a profit-making entity. Now, in the case of the government, the owner the owner are the people, taxpayers, us. Yes. But for all practical purposes, the owner is Treasury. So Treasury finds that some costs are not allowed. That means it has to bear them itself.
Okay.
Let's take a very concrete example. Instead of hunting lodges, which we don't have, I hope. Let's think about, coal purchase, where it could have been obtained for, let's say, $100 a ton or something. And instead we are paying 110. So it has now been, contract has been signed with the regulator looks at it and says, no, that 10 cannot be allowed. So where does that 10 go? That goes to Treasury.
Okay.
Treasury has to take that loss. So now on both sides, what they're getting is on both sides. So if it went there, the ratepayer, the people who are paying for electricity would pay. If it went the other way, the people who pay for the electricity would be paying as taxpayers. So it doesn't make any sense. Right? It doesn't make sense for the government. It doesn't make sense for the company. It doesn't change the company's behavior or any of that. So that model that we have talked about, that is the standard model of tariff regulation, doesn't work for state-owned enterprises.
Yeah, clearly.
Right? Now, what is the solution? In the 2002 Act, the original Act, they came up with a solution. And that solution was then distorted because the JVP compelled the government, the new government that came in, to repeal that act and come up with another act in 2009. Right? Now, the original act said we are going to break up the company into different parts, CB into different parts. And that will allow us to compare these parts to each other. So they had to be standalone entities with their own accounts, their own management, and so on and so forth. They couldn't be sitting in the same building, drinking the same, eating at the same canteen and all that. Now, what the JVP did, and the electricity board engineers went along with that, was that they all got their promotions. All these guys got, I'm the head of this license company, I'm the head of that company. Everybody got their pay raises, increases, and so on. But they're all meshed up together. The accounts are not separate. So it's not possible to compare one against the other. Right? So this idea of comparing one against the other is called benchmark regulation. The other one is called rate-based rate of return regulation. This is benchmark regulation. Now, in benchmark regulation, the regulator has got some way of looking at something and say, why is company A, which is in the same line of business in the same country as company C, getting so much lower prices for coal or spending so much less on meter reading than company C? So company C, you're a bad company. Now, there's no point in disallowing their costs. But you can do something called naming and shaming. You can, create conditions where before you come for the next tariff increase, you should have reduced the salaries of people who are responsible for this kind of bad behavior. So you could create some incentives.
That there will be some sense of accountability.
Now, that is not there.
Yes.
Right? So that's why I say there's no, and lastly, I think what people should realize is, this has reached sort of it had reached pathological level of complexity in the United States, because both sides get consultants, they get lawyers, and a tariff case takes, if you're lucky, a tariff case takes a year, right? So there is huge amounts of information have to be provided in specified formats. Then the consultants from the other side analyze it, and then they have interrogatories or questions under oath, and then they have an actual hearing with cross-examination. All this takes a long time, right? Now, people may have noticed that tariff reviews don't take a long time in Sri Lanka. They can be done in 2-3 weeks. What that means is that if you do tariff reviews in 2-3 weeks, you're not getting into the details, right? You're just sort of performing what I would call regulatory theater. You're giving people the impression that there is some kind of review going on, when in fact there is no review.
Right.
So the system is broken. We had a sort of the optimum solution, then we went to a suboptimal solution because of the 2002 Act, because there was no possibility of privatizing at this point. Then the JVP unions and various other people got together and they destroyed even the suboptimal solution. So there is just sort of a mess.
Right. The mess that we're in right now.
Well, the mess is, so I'll try to bring it back to what it means for us, is that there is no guarantee for the electricity consumer today that we can give them in good conscience, that the costs that the minister is talking about, that the electricity board is submitting, the regulator is approving, are the lowest possible costs. There can be all sorts of things hidden there. I gave an example of an inefficiency, which is spending, 800 rupees to collect a 300 rupee bill.
Right.
There's a simple example that anyone can understand. And, there are court cases. I'm not speaking out of turn. There are court cases. There are sort of people have gone on record to say that there is corruption in the procurement of coal.
Right.
So, if there is corruption in the procurement of coal, these cases have not been settled. Serious allegations have been made. So, we could say there's a possibility, there's a high probability that some of the input costs are not the lowest possible input costs. Now, these days, things are very ugly because we don't have the money, we are paying demurrage, not people are not willing to sell to Sri Lanka. Obviously, you're paying a premium, right? It's sort of poor people pay more for the same thing that the rich pay less. That's sort of the unfairness of the world. So Sri Lanka is now a poor bankrupt country, and we are paying more for coal and fuel than other people are. But beyond that, some corruption-driven costs could also be in there. So then when you look at your tariffs and you say, you hear the minister and all these people saying, we need to cover costs. Say, yeah, but you're covering costs that include some things that should not be included.
Right. So, Professor, you spoke of briefly unbundling, privatization, and all these buzzwords that have been thrown around in the public sphere from a lot of a lot of people, and I think there seems to be on a certain end a demonization of privatization, and at a certain end there also seems to be a glorification of privatization. And I think it would behoove us if we did not speak on the merits and the demerits of the process of privatization. So, for example, you spoke of in 2002 when there was an attempt to unbundle CEB. And in 2009, if I'm not mistaken, there was a vertical unbundling where we had CEB was split into 6 different entities, one for what was it, transmission, generation, and 4 for supply, if I'm not mistaken. So let's go at it step by step, if that's okay with you. So first and foremost, opponents of privatization claim that by making something so intrinsic to day-to-day life, electricity and power generation, handing that over to a profit-making entity would at some end leave a large percentage of a population that have access to electricity vulnerable to certain things like retroactive pricing, unfettered costings, where the company is essentially would be looking at their profit margin and not looking at accessibility or these equity principles that the state-owned monopoly has been running for so far.
I don't think the state-owned monopoly has been running on equity principles. The state-owned monopoly has been running on the principle of serving its primary stakeholder, which is its employees. Secondary stakeholder, which is the political authorities who want to stuff the organization with more and more employees. Thirdly, various kinds of actors who want to make money off this in terms of commissions and kickbacks and things like that. So the whole business of the consumer has been a secondary matter. The question is, if you don't have private ownership, that is, people risking their money in this activity, the incentives don't work. That's the most important. That's what I explained earlier.
Yes.
The incentives don't work, right? So if the incentives don't work, the various kinds of regulatory pressures that you could bring to bear become ineffective.
Right.
I mean, you can't go back to sort of, whipping people in the streets or something like that. So you have to use something more civilized, which is to say, we will disallow your costs.
Yes.
You're a bad person. We will put your name in a list of people who are doing inefficient electricity supply, right? That's what you can do. So, government, government ownership, state ownership doesn't solve any problems. Uh, there are some good aspects because a private entity, if it was supplying electricity, would ask a question: is it really valuable for me to have a wire going down the slopes of Mimure to connect the village of Mimure, which is one of the most remote villages in Sri Lanka, to the electricity grid? Or does it make more sense for me economically to have a standalone electricity system there where, even if I spend a bit more on batteries or generators or something for the evening, it still makes sense for me to do that because running that wire for a long distance, maintaining it and so on is going to be very, very costly. So they make rational decisions.
Right.
Now, in the state-owned structure, you don't make those rational decisions. You say, oh, can you imagine the photo opportunity that I'll have the day we connect the village of Mimure? So let's connect the village of Mimure. And then you just spend money like it's sure not your money, it's somebody else's.
Sure.
You spend that money inefficiently to connect the village of Mimure. And then you get praise from everybody for having treated the people in the most remote area of Sri Lanka with kindness and electricity. Right? Now, in both scenarios, if you do the rational thing, you'd still be giving them electricity.
Right.
And you could still give them electricity at a subsidized rate, as we can subsidize things.
Yes.
There's nothing against subsidies.
Okay.
But the cost would be low.
Right.
So, the fact that in a privately owned environment, the prices will go up and down, would follow global fuel costs. Is it unfair? Is it unavoidable? That's what I would ask.
Right.
In the case of state ownership, we'll say, oh, an election is coming. We are not going to allow the prices to track the input costs because we'll raise it after the election. Now, during that period, the company is going to incur enormous losses, which will have to be borne by somebody else. Either by treasury, if they have the money. If they don't have treasury, they'll have to print money. And thereby, everybody will pay through inflation. So, it's a complex story like that.
Yes.
So, you have to look at incentives. You have to understand that it's a monopoly, whatever said and done.
Yeah, for sure.
And you have to have some regulatory safeguards, effective regulatory safeguards, not regulatory theatre.
Sure. So, Professor, what would the process of privatization look like? Like I said before, it has been a buzzword that has been thrown around, and not a lot of people are aware of what it would look like or what the steps that can be taken up, or the steps that we should, as the public, be pushing for if privatization is something that we want.
So, electricity has got three elements, right? So, there's generation, transmission, which is the high voltage wires that you see in Battaramulla and places like that, the big pylons. And then what it's called distribution, but it's actually distribution and billing. That is stepping down the voltage and bringing it on wires that sort of you see on the sides of the roads, bringing it to the homes, and then making sure that those wires are working and people are not electrocuted and equipment is not destroyed and so on, and that bills are provided, accurate metering is done, and money is collected. So those are basically the three components. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that there is a degree of private participation on the generation side. Yeah. Right? At various times it has been much higher. Right now, I think it's mostly CEB thermal that is running. But just let's take one example there. Everybody has heard of Norwich, which is the big coal plant that we have. Now, I'm not going to give a proposal that I came up with. I'm going to give you a proposal that a senior minister, Dr. Sarattam, came up. When Norwich was breaking down, all the time. Even you have to understand these things don't run 100% of the time. They have to be taken offline. Maintenance has to be done. Various things like that have to happen. But in some cases, the thing breaks, right? So there's a former professor of electrical engineering, Professor Kumar David, who once said, "This is so bad, it should be sold for scrap." Now, I never agreed with that, but he said it should be sold for scrap. He's a professor of electrical engineering, I'm not, right? So Sarantamagama said, wouldn't it be better if we sold Norwich back to the Chinese who built it? It was one of their early
investments.
Well, for that company, it was one of the early coal plants that they built.
Right.
So they were actually using it as a bit of a guinea pig. So he said, why don't we sell it back to them and buy electricity from them? You see, you built it on loans, and loans have to be repaid. Even when the generator is not producing electricity because it's got a breakdown, you're still paying paying back your loan and interest. Right? Now, that's one scenario. That's the scenario we live in now. Right?
Yeah.
Whether or not Norwich produces electricity, we pay our loans and interest. Supposing it was the other alternative, where it's owned by the Chinese company, then we pay only for the electricity that we buy. So then all you have is an agreement that both sides have come up, a long-term agreement about electricity purchases. They don't have anybody else to sell to. We don't have anybody else to buy 900 megawatts of power from. We're both dependent on each other. We come up with some agreement.
Right.
So what is wrong with that, I would ask?
That's a fair question to ask.
Professor Dr. Amrugama's proposal seems like a reasonable proposal. But then, of course, you don't get the psychological satisfaction of actually owning a coal plant. I mean, I personally don't feel better at the end of the day thinking, oh my goodness, I have some tiny little ownership stake in a coal plant. I can sleep better today. That's sort of not part of my psychology, but maybe I don't have the normal psychology of the people who make these kinds of arguments. They're just happy about owning things, right? Even if it doesn't make sense, they're happy. So that happiness has to be looked after. Now we have the transmission grid.
Yes.
Very high cost, right? And critical. So I was happy to see a group of electricity CB engineers, management, senior people, had looked at it and said they have nothing against the, interestingly, breaking up of the transmission grid into two parts, two companies, and allowing for private investment in both. So we would say, I'm just making it up, say the northern grid and the southern grid. And in both cases, we allow 51%. They said 51% private ownership.
Okay.
In all these cases, I'm saying, they're not my proposals, somebody else's. So that is not a bad idea, if you really think about it. Why do they make that suggestion? Because one of the most important things about transmission is that we don't have enough investment in transmission. People may remember the nationwide blackouts that we had. We've had several of those. That is because our grid is not properly configured. No self-respecting country has countrywide blackouts. I mean, you can have blackouts in areas. That's unavoidable. These are difficult things to manage. But the whole country going down just says that it's bad engineering. And we've had several of these. 2016, 2017, etc. And we all know, I have written about it, we all know there's a problem in what is called the Biegama substation. Why if we know that's the problem, why don't we fix it? Because we don't have the money.
Right.
How are we going to fix it? If your only source of money is either the government or loans that the government negotiates. Isn't it better to have a private investor make that investment? Okay, so that's transition. They are inadequately resourced, and for those who are interested in serious use of renewables, unless you up the game on the transmission grid, can't take a lot of renewables into the system.
Yeah.
Big solar farms, big windmills cannot be absorbed without the transmission grid being re-engineered, redesigned, capacity added to absorb them. I won't get into too much detail on that. Then comes the question of distribution. I would say that's the last part. There's plenty of precedent. Delhi, Bombay, places with lots of poor people, places like ours, where distribution is done by private companies.
Right. Okay.
And they make rational decisions, like how to actually bill for, not to spend more on collecting the bill than what you get
Out of it.
Yes. And they actually give returns. These are public-private partnerships. The Delhi Distribution Company, they actually give returns. I mean, it's partly government-owned, partly privately owned. And the government actually gets dividends from the company. And we've looked at the billing systems and so on. My organization, ours versus theirs, pretty good, much better. Their bills are understandable. I wonder, has anybody looked at electricity bill recently? Can you actually understand your bill?
It takes a bit of getting used to.
Yeah, you should see what the Tatas and companies, Reliance and companies like that, the kind of bills that they have provided. They give you the ability to compare last month's consumption with this month's.
Right. Okay.
Things like that. Much more understandable.
And much more easy to digest.
Yeah.
Professor, just one quick thing before we wrap up. You were speaking about the psychology of owning, and how that utility seems to be very important to those that make decisions in the state. There has been a few murmurings about purchasing power from India and getting investment from, say, one company only from the international sphere. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there are reasonable fears about becoming dependent on India. I think there are reasonable fears. Because you see, if you depend on another for a critical input, that person can exercise some leverage on that. Now, just recently, Finland was pulling about 10% of its electricity from Russia, and Russia said, "Oh, you're not being nice to us with regard to this war in Ukraine. We are not going to give you any electricity." But Finland was not dependent totally on Russia. It was dependent on Norway, etc., and they managed. So I think you need to take rational decisions about things like that. Our problem is, of course, our geography is given. We are close to India. We are far from everybody else. So the Finnish solution doesn't work here. Right? So what you have then is you have legal, arbitral, various kinds of safeguards about how this problem can be managed. The JVP leader, Mr. Andrukumar said, at one of these meetings held at a Colombo hotel with the entire business community in attendance, said, "Oh no, we have changed. We are open to private participation in all sectors of the economy, but definitely not in energy. Specifically not in renewables."
Right.
specifically mentioned renewables. No foreign investment. Foreign investment will be allowed in. So my question was, I actually wrote about this, was, what is the understanding that the person had of what it takes to produce electricity from wind and solar? Both these things, you see, the common sense approach says, the wind blows, it's ours, it's Sri Lankan wind, or it's Sri Lankan sun. Yeah, sure. So Sri Lankan sun has been falling on us for many years. It hasn't produced any electricity by itself. Sri Lankan wind has been blowing across this land for millennia.
Yeah.
It hasn't produced any electricity. So what does it take to produce electricity from the Sri Lankan wind and Sri Lankan sun? It takes a large amount of capital investment. Right? Now, capital investment upfront. Oh, but there's no recurrent expenditure. You don't have to keep buying coal. Yeah, I agree. That's one reason why I like renewables. You don't have to keep buying coal and deal with the fluctuations of the world market. But right at the beginning, you have to spend a significant amount of money, maybe more than when using other kinds of sources, to build the wind plant. So the generators, the turbines, the cranes that lift the turbines. People who talk about these things should next time they're out on the road, stop by one of these things, a wind turbine, and just stand next to it and take a photograph. You will find that the thing is a monster, right? It's sort of unbelievably large. So even the cranes to lift these things have to be brought from India.
Right.
So putting up renewable facilities at a commercial scale requires an enormous upfront import of foreign material. Okay, so we won't allow foreigners to invest in this, but we are going to buy a whole lot of foreign stuff, right? We don't make any solar panels.
Yes, we don't.
Theoretically, you could, but it won't be efficient. You can get like multiple solar panels from China for the cost of producing one here. So what are we going to do now? Because we have this fixation about foreigners not owning things. We have to take loans, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, Mr. Distortions, have you heard that Sri Lanka is bankrupt right now? And we are not paying our previous creditors? So do you think people are sort of lining up to give us more money? So this is the illogic of a lot of these things. I would say that getting an investor in, if you like, have PPPs, public-private partnerships. If you are really deeply concerned about, national security implications of an Indian company selling power to you based on Sri Lankan wind, make it a requirement that X% of senior engineers, etc., should be Sri Lankans, should be given security clearance by whoever gives these things. Take some specific safeguards to make sure that bad things don't happen, whatever bad things that you fear. But make those safeguards, not some kind of blanket statements about I don't like foreign investment because foreign investment is going to harm my national security or something like that. That doesn't make any sense, right? If they share in the risk and for that they take some money, so fine, Mr. Distortions said, oh, what is the difference? If we have an Indian investor here, they'll be taking their money out. They'll be taking money out of the country, valuable foreign exchange, out of the country every year, every month. Yeah, of course. That's what foreign investment means. But it also means that we didn't have to compromise on other things and take loans to buy the wind turbines and to to pay for the installers and things like that. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, and,
And a lot of people don't understand trade-offs. I hope these kinds of conversations will help them.
I certainly hope they do, Professor. So I guess if there was one takeaway that we can get from this episode would be that the energy problem in Sri Lanka exists within a mire of irrationality and perhaps a little bit of rationality from our ends as consumers, from the regulatory divisions and from the CEB and the like, would help everyone get over this as soon as possible. So, Professor Samarajiva, I would like to thank you for educating us on how to navigate this current social dilemma that society is facing at the moment. And I'd like to thank you once again for helping us understand and perhaps taking away the narrative that is a demonization of privatization and like foreign direct investment that could come in this sphere. And with that, we'd like to end this episode of Reset Now and hope to see you all next time that we can have a discussion.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.